Hey guys, so I've had this idea for a while that I want to try out called Let's Talk Garbage. Essentially, this would be a series of short episodes dedicated to technical information on waste sustainability. I'm a chemical engineer who has been working in the field of waste management for 6 years now, and I recognize that there is a growing awareness and concern of the public around the topic of waste pollution. So, as an engineer, I wanted to bring to the forefront of this public discussion technical information on waste management. And so, with all that said, let's talk garbage. So, this first episode will provide just a general overview of waste management and introduce some basic concepts and terminologies that I think we should all be familiar with as responsible waste generators. So, what is garbage? Well, in everyday talk, we can call it garbage, trash, waste. In the technical vernacular, we refer to it as waste, and there can be solid waste, liquid waste. This series focuses on solid waste. And there are several categories of solid waste. There's construction and demolition debris, sludge, hazardous waste, and what this series will focus on is something called municipal solid waste, or MSW, which is pictured here. This diagram shows the breakdown of solid waste into some of those categories, and municipal solid waste is a combination of commercial and residential waste. To be more specific, the definition of MSW is waste that is generated by the residential sector, by the commercial sector, such as businesses and restaurants, as well as by institutions like schools, hospitals, and prisons. One of the reasons that waste management is so complex is because, well, just take a look in your garbage can today. Do you see the diversity and the array of products that we dispose of daily? From an engineering and scientific standpoint, when we're trying to have processes that can optimally treat this, having such a heterogeneous mix that can vary day to day, from season to season, can be quite difficult. If I had to break down MSW into just 3 categories based on materials, this is what they would be. The first one is organics. Organic matter refers to any matter that is derived from a living organism. And so in terms of waste, this includes food waste, like that banana peel there, yard trimmings, wood waste, etc. The next category is recyclables. This is referring to any material that can be mechanically recycled into a new product. And the primary materials that fall under that are metals, glass, plastics, also referred to as MGP. But as a lot of us know, not all of these are recyclable. One example is film plastics. Film plastics generally don't have recycling technologies available, or there just aren't recycling markets for them. But that does not mean that plastics are the culprit and the only cause of our waste pollution problem. In fact, there are ways that we can sustainably manage and divert film plastics from landfills, and this is something that I will talk about later on in this series. And so we have organics, we have recyclables, and then that leaves us with our last category, which is a catch-all category of other that includes everything else. It's a miscellaneous category. So in waste management, we have something called the waste management hierarchy. What this does is it provides a framework, guidelines to a community, a municipality, as to how to sustainably manage its waste. What it does is it ranks the waste practices from most preferred at top to least preferred at the bottom. So the most preferred waste practice is reduction and reuse, and the least preferred is disposal, such as landfilling. The ultimate goal of the waste management hierarchy is to reduce the negative environmental impact of our waste by showing us how we can treat our waste as a resource as opposed to seeing it as a pollutant. As responsible waste generators, we should be familiar with the primary waste practices. They are reduction, reuse, composting and anaerobic digestion, recycling, energy recovery, which includes waste to energy, gasification, pyrolysis, and landfilling. This chart here is a breakdown of MSW in the United States by materials. This is taken from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And so it shows the current state of our waste and the material breakdown, so you have paper, plastics, food, etc. What I've done here on this slide is take that material breakdown and convert it to that oversimplified breakdown of those three categories that we talked about before. As a disclaimer, this is an oversimplification, which I'll talk about later on, but it's to drive home a point. So looking at just solely the material composition of the waste that we generate today, what we can see is that 35% of the waste that we generate is made up of organics, around 40% is made up of recyclables, and then there's 25% that falls under the other category. So looking at this simplified version, someone would think, hey, it seems that the waste that we generate today, 75% of it can already be diverted from landfills. Why? Well, 35% is organic, so it can be treated through composting and anaerobic digestion. 40% is recyclable, so it can be treated through recycling. So 35 plus 40, that's 75%. Unfortunately, that is not the actual case. We'll get into in a little bit. But the main point that I want to drive home from this slide is that solely based on material composition, there's 25% of the waste that we generate today that cannot be treated through composting or treated through recycling. So it's the inherent material composition of our waste that a quarter of it has to be treated a different way. And there are different ways, which we'll get into. But the reason I bring this up is because there is a common misconception today that all of our waste currently can be managed through reduce, reuse, recycle. Now, the goal of a circular economy is to essentially manufacture materials in a way those are the only three ways we have to manage our waste. But in the current times today, we still have 25% of our waste based on material that needs to be treated a different way. Okay, so where does our waste actually go? Again, this is taken from the EPA, and it's the management of MSW in the US currently. So currently, 53% of our MSW is landfilled. 26% is recycled, 13% goes to waste to energy, and less than 10% is composted. So again, bringing it back to this oversimplification, comparing reality to that ideal scenario, someone would say, hey, but based on the material composition of the waste that we generate today, I would think that 35% of our waste would get composted since 35% of it is made up of organics. Why are we only composting 10%? Or hey, our MSW consists of 40% recyclables. Why is our recycling rate only 26%? And if our waste, 25% of it is this other, why is our landfilling so high as 53%? What are the reasons for the discrepancies between reality and this ideal scenario? And the answer to that question is waste management is very complex. Not only is it complex from a scientific and engineering standpoint, but it's also complex because it's a socio-political, economic, and geographic issue. So these are factors that affect waste management. One of the things that I mentioned is a disclaimer that I oversimplified the breakdown of MSW. And I say that because, yes, we can see that food waste technically falls under organics, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all of that food waste can be, let's say, digested. And I'll give an example. My background's in energy recovery, so this is the most succinct I can be. Let's say you have food waste that cannot be composted or cannot be anaerobically digested, and it goes to waste to energy. Sometimes that food waste cannot be thermally recycled because its moisture content is too high. So there are inherent material properties that may limit the treatment of certain materials. But this, I would say, is minor compared to all of the other factors that affect waste management. A major factor and challenge currently in waste management is optimal waste collection infrastructure. there are the technologies out there to treat such a diversity of the waste that we generate. The issue is getting the waste separated into purer streams and then getting them to the appropriate technologies that are going to beneficially and optimally use them in a way that they'll be used as a resource as opposed to treating it as a waste. So there's a lot of room for growth in terms of waste collection infrastructure. Another factor that affects waste management is economics. One of the reasons why the materials or some of the materials that get collected for recycling aren't actually recycled is because the recycling markets don't exist for that product in that point in time. Policies also impact waste management, which is something I'll talk about briefly in the next slide, as well as geography. One of the reasons that we landfill as much as we do in the US is because we have abundant land in the West. We can literally continue landfilling for hundreds of years just based on our available land. By comparison, if you compare to an island nation like Japan, you will see that landfilling is negligible because they just don't have the land space to do so. And waste generator behavior is another factor that impacts our waste management. So this slide here is showing the impact of policy on waste management. This is a graph comparing waste management in the US to the EU. And so in the EU, the European Union, in the mid-2000s, they implemented a policy called the Landfill Directive. Essentially, this directive requires that all EU member states reduce the amount of MSW that they send to landfills to a certain target. And so as a result, what we can see is landfilling currently in the US is at 53%, whereas in the EU, it's only at 26%. And you can see a trend since the implementation of this landfill directive, the decline of landfilling in the EU. So by comparison, in the US, we don't have really any national waste policies, and we don't have any national landfilling policy similar to the landfill directive. I mentioned that waste generator behavior also impacts our waste management. This graph here is taken from the EPA, and what it shows is the recycling rate of recyclable products. So since these are all recyclable products, it means they have the technologies to recycle them and the markets. So you would think, oh, okay, the recycling rate should be at 100% for all of them. But we can see clearly that it's not. Let's take a look at PET bottles and jars. These are referring to those clear plastic bottles that you may drink water from and so on. Their recycling rate is only at 30%. There are several factors that come into play as to why that is, but one of them is us. The reason that we can have low recycling rates is because we're not taking those clear plastic bottles and putting them in the recycling bin. Or we might be putting them in the wrong recycling bin. Or we might just be throwing it into the black bags that are the trash that goes to landfills. So we also play a part in how we can sustainably manage our waste. So I hope you guys learned something from this first episode, but essentially in this series what I would like to do is provide a visual tour of waste management, really showing you guys where our waste goes after we throw it into the trash or the recycling bin, taking you on tours of facilities and so on. I also think it's so important as we have this public discussion around waste pollution and how to address it, that we talk to the experts, people who have dedicated their lives to this issue of waste management, and talk to technical experts who can provide solutions as to how we can go about it. And lastly, as I mentioned, my background is in energy recovery, and so I would like to introduce some innovative ideas that are being developed as to how we can use these technologies to address those items in our waste that cannot be recycled and that cannot be composted or reused. And so these are just some images of things that I will show you in more detail later on. This is an example of reuse, a creative example of reuse, of taking plastic straws and creating a fashionable coat. These are anaerobic digesters that can be used to treat food waste and get energy from them. This is just showing you visually all of the materials that we send for recycling that get baled and are ready to be taken to turn into new products if the markets exist for them. This is an example of innovative energy recovery, essentially taking those foam plastics, those plastics that cannot be mechanically recycled, and converting them back into the oil that they're derived from. So creating a heating oil or a transport oil, and essentially offsetting the oil that needs to be drilled for those purposes. And also talking about landfill. So I encourage you guys in the meantime to check out these resources on waste management. There's a project called Be Waste Wise, which is an online platform which is great, that has all of these discussions and topics of experts around the world talking about waste sustainability. And if you're interested in the research and development side of this topic, I encourage you to visit the websites of WTERT Columbia University, the Earth Engineering Center at the City College of New York, and the Environmental Research and Education Foundation. Thank you for your time, and let's talk garbage. I hope you enjoyed. Bye.